Hello, everybody. We're back. It's a Sunday episode, so happy Sunday to everyone. And we are joined again by our good friend Elliott. Hello, Elliott. Elliott is here, and we are gonna get hyper theoretical on this one. If you thought the last Elliott episode was very theoretical, just you wait. We're going to be talking about the Christian idea of the Trinity and cybernetics. And so this is Elliott's idea, and maybe I just say that initially in case it all goes wrong. I don't think it will, but this was Elliott's idea, which doesn't make it a bad idea. It's just I'm somebody. I guess I'll just start out. I'm somebody who knows really nothing about cybernetics. When I hear the word cybernetics, I think of like the Matrix, and I think of Skynet, and I think of computers killing us all, and I just want to be Ron Swanson, and I want to just live in a hut somewhere and, like, I don't know, eat deer meat or something like that. So I'm as I've said before, I live in the past, and I'm just kind of all over this modern world, and I don't really get it, and it doesn't really make any sense to me, and it produces anxiety. So when I hear the word cybernetics, I get a little squirrely, perhaps. So, which is to say, Elliott, since this is your brainchild and you know more about cybernetics than I do we want to start with cybernetics? Do we want to start with the Trinity? Because we're going to attempt to bring them together in this episode. It's a tall order. I leave it up to you. You direct this.
Yeah. So okay. Well, I'll start with. I'll go ahead and start with the definition of cybernetics, since it's weighing heavy on our minds.
On my mind.
Exactly right. So here's kind of the issue: is that cybernetics is voodoo. It's a really vague term. Even in the quote unquote like literature, it's vague. So here's the thing: is that cybernetics came up as an idea in the 60s when people were trying to think about control systems, right? And it was introduced by various, it was introduced and then taken up by various disciplines, right? Like computer people obviously were excited about it, but biologists too were pretty excited about it, because you can model a lot of organisms as a cybernetic agent, right? So without teasing too much, I went through just to make sure, double check. I'm like, okay, what is the real definition? Like, has a mathematician gotten a hold of this? And the answer is kind of no. Like, there's too many definitions. It's very vague, but essentially a cybernetic system has the following three attributes, right? It has an observation system. It has a controlling system, a choice-making system of some sort, and then an action system. So the example with the human body is you have eyes, ears, those are the input system. You have a brain that makes decisions what to do with those inputs, right? And then a body that delivers the outputs that you want to go into the universe. And that's a simpler example of a cybernetic system is your thermostat, right? So your thermostat is passively monitoring the temperature in the room, says, hey, heater heats the room, and then it's like, yep, it's 70 degrees or whatever, 75 degrees, and then it flips off. It says, yep, we're happy with the temperature now, and then waits till it drops till 70. That's a very simple cybernetic system. Are you following me so far?
Yeah. No, it's just we're experiencing some cybernetics here. I'm hopefully the internet. Hopefully we'll keep rolling here. Hopefully this works. You as you're talking about cybernetics, you're starting to get all like digitalized, and I'm like, see, it's Skynet. It's just it hates us for talking about this. It's gonna eat us now. So hopefully you're still there. Keep going.
What did that? Did you hear it? Maybe I need to try again.
No, the thermostat, right? Like the way like an auto thermostat controls temperature within a building is what I'm guessing was what you're talking about, something like that.
Yeah, right, and that's the simplest, easiest case to kind of keep in your mind. If you're ever like freaked out, you can always think about it. It's just like a thermostat. Now, of course, it could get really complicated, but it's essentially like, think about a thermostat first.
Right.
And you are also, so anything. Okay. Another way to think about a cybernetic system is anything attempting to maintain some version of homeostasis, for a biology term, right?
Yeah.
And again, so yes, so that's the bare bones definition of a cybernetic system.
That's not as scary as I thought it would be. I thought it would be something like incredibly weird and postmodern, but that's actually far more grounded and, dare I say, based like in reality.
Well,
so yeah.
Right. So with the weird postmodern thing is then when you start shopping around for applications for this definition, because where it gets weird is in the sheer number of things that technically are cybernetic systems, right? And just to kind of give you a teaser of how weird this gets almost immediately, right? So I said that a thermostat, right, is a cybernetic system, okay? So I will invite you to think as a Misesian for a moment about the notion of an actor, right? And then you're like, uh-oh, an actor has an observation ability. It has a set of preferences that controls its outputs, AKA actions. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, snap. All of human action really is just cybernetic action. And then when you get that one, you're like, ooh, snap. All of a sudden your thermostat is kind of a market actor in the sense that, you know, all of the human action stuff that applies, right? Applies. It's just that thermostats don't care about market stuff, right? They only care about the temperature in the room. They have a tiny preference set, but technically speaking, there's a lot of ways in which human action still applies. And so then that's kind of crazy. But anyway, yeah, I'll you know.
No, yeah, I appreciate the human
we don't
action.
have to get down that rabbit hole.
The human action pun is, I appreciate the human action pun.
Yes.
No, that's I appreciate that. I see what you did there. Okay, yeah, no, that is actually yeah, it helps me grasp it more because yeah, like we were talking about before we started recording, I am a lot of things, and in many ways I'm a jack of all trades when it comes to the humanities, but I am an expert in a few things, not this at all. And I'm definitely not a computer science person. I'm definitely not a math person. So anytime you start getting all loosey-goosey with this stuff, I get a fair amount of intellectual anxiety. So that's helpful, and hopefully that's helpful to people who are watching here, because yeah, like cybernetics, I'm like, what you mean?
And frankly, it took me a long time to really like track this down, because like I say, the quote unquote literature is pretty vague about this, and there are a lot of people who are more excited about sounding smart, I think, in this space than actually communicating a clear idea. And so that's all I do, is I steal people's ideas and make them more clear. And sometimes that's reductionist, and sometimes it's just greatly clarifying. So
yeah, well, I always quote you. You know, you're the intellectual street fighter, or the philosophical street fighter. I appreciate this. This is really nice. No, it's yeah, you have to be able, you synthesize, and
yes.
Yeah, and so some of us, such as myself, whose brains are just not wired. I know it's sort of dangerous these days to talk about innate neural differences between people, but it's true. I am just, my brain's not wired to think about hard, like things like math that require sort of like hard, for lack of a better term, hard inputs. I'm like, blah, I lose track of that pretty quickly. Whereas something like, well, what we're going to get into, like the Trinity, which is largely mysterious, I'm like, well, I can roll with the mystery, man. The mystery is great. It's those hard input things. I'm like, you've lost me. It is completely.
Well, no, and it's hilarious because I am hilariously bad at languages. Like, I've tried to learn foreign languages, I just can't do it. I can barely even learn English. It's because I'm like bad with nouns. But anyway, we'll okay. So that's cybernetic, right? And again, we're gonna revisit cybernetic in a second here, because that is just that's not the really interesting version of cybernetics that everybody is really excited about. But anyway, so just to recap, you've got three different components of this system. And again, this is not a system. Don't think about it like an object. Think about it more like a phenomena, and that will help, right? Okay. Some cybernetic systems are objects. Some of them are not objects, right? And you'll see why a little bit later. But so you have a sensing, observing input object, right? You've got a deciding, choosing controller, right? Second part. And then you have a third part, which is an actioning, acting, outputting thing, right? Just to use words that hopefully one of them resonates with you.
No, that's very helpful. At least for me, I think it'll be helpful. It's a very good explanation, and you've nicely succinctly synthesized it. So I think that's
good. That's 15 hours.
I'm already learning a lot.
Around.
Yeah, well, see, we all benefit now from your hard work. So thank you for being sharing about that. Yeah.
God. All right, go ahead. Oh yeah. So then the Trinity, right?
The Trinity.
So then the Trinity, right? Okay. So now let's much more mysterious thing.
Let's also not assume that people know what the Trinity is.
Go ahead.
So, well, let's do this collaboratively because I have a. So I guess I'll just say first and foremost, I'm somebody who has I'm a lay person, who is Christian, specifically Lutheran. I have a huge interest in theology as a lay person. It is not my main field of study. However, my main field of study kind of like, here to use a fancy computer term, interfaces with theology. See, I'm attempting to speak in your diction, Elliott. I don't know how well I'm succeeding. So I'm somebody, I do a lot of religious history. So that's what a lot of my, when I'm not, I know on this channel I talk a lot about language because I also really love language. But like my big dissertation level research stuff that I did and I'm still doing is on religious history. So of course that's, if you're going to look at religious history, you better look at theology, but you're looking at theology more through the lens of like, how did these, theological movements in this point in time, in this place with this guy and this other guy, like, did they like each other or not? How did that influence what happened later? So this kind of like broader kind of like, I look a lot at like, how do religious movements influence culture and politics? Particularly in the early modern or like medieval period. So again, as somebody who is Christian, who is part of a Trinitarian group, sect of Christianity, so I have that. I have sort of my basic, for any other frozen chosen out there, I got my basic small catechism going on there. Nobody? Okay, it's a Lutheran thing. I got the
frozen chosen part.
Luther small catechism, for all those people in the Midwest. I got that, right? And then I also have sort of a general knowledge of sort of European Christianity. Specifically, I will say as a big asterisk to that, the Western part, we were talking about before recording, I have Orthodox friends whom I love, but when we talk about theology, we like use the same words and we're clearly talking about something else and we get really confused and we're like, oh, well, and then we're still friends because it's like, we don't really, it's almost like an Inigo Montoya moment, you keep saying this word. I don't think it means what you think it means. It's like, and the Trinity is one of these things, particularly between the East and the West, Eastern and Western churches. It's a huge, a simultaneously small and gigantic difference, let's say. Right. Small in the sense that it is one, which version of the Nicene Creed are you talking about? And then big in the sense that, at least on paper, it's sort of cited as, quote, the reason for the break between, the East-West schism. Although, as we were also talking about before recording, I think that's largely just a post hoc kind of explanation of what really happened. I think a crumbling empire, right? Like, and one imperial church, there's going to be some schisms that are going to happen regardless of like.
Well, the Eastern Roman Empire really never got along, right? Like, let's be real.
Well, it's like what was it the other day I was listening to something with Yarvin on it, and he was talking about the Roman Empire was like a bunch of city states with the same foreign policy. It wasn't like you think, like it was top down, but not in the way you think. There was a huge amount of regional difference, and just you could look into the Christian era too. It's like, who is the bishop of this area? Well, you're going to get a lot of difference in practice, but also in theology, right? Because there's all sorts of debates, right? Of like, particularly in the early church, right? Like who is God and who is Christ and how does that work? And what is salvation, right? And all these big questions. So
yeah, God help the future scholars and budding scholars and philosophical street fighters who try to untangle what the fuck was happening in the United States. Like, God help them.
Well, speaking of apropos crumbling empires, yeah. Well, and so I guess which is to say, I have my personal beliefs about the Trinity, which are heavily influenced by the tradition that I'm part of. Then I have my broadly speaking, historical understanding of how that worked in the church over the years. But I will say, right, because we should always be honest, as we should always tell the truth, or at the very least don't tell a lie. Jordan Peterson would remind us, I am not like the world. I'm not a professional theologian, right? Like, I enjoy theology quite a bit. I did not go to seminary. I interface with it in my research, but I'm not an expert, right? And I'm definitely not an expert in early church Trinitarian debates, because it's just not the time period that I really study when I'm doing religious history, right? I'm doing like the Reformation, we can talk about. That is my jam. But early church stuff, I'm like, well, yeah, nobody really knew what the Trinity was, and everyone hated each other. And, as we were talking about before recording, even good old Saint Nick is punching Arians in the face during church councils. So it was obviously it's a big deal. I'm not downplaying the importance of that time period in Christian history, nor the importance of like Trinitarian theology today. I'm just saying, I'm going to hit you. We'll talk about it, but everyone should just know, like, I'm doing my best, but I'm definitely a layperson. I'm not claiming some sort of expertise in this. So that's just wanted to get that out of the way.
No, totally. And as we discussed beforehand, it's time for me to also do my throat clearing as well, in terms of like,
yep.
Right. I don't even have like a religious studies degree. However, what I did do is I went through a period of being a part of, for a good portion of my life, a non-Trinitarian Arian restorationist sect of Christianity. So think like, the same general era of like Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses, and people like actually reading the Bible and saying, wait a minute, Luther allowed for y'all to read the Bible, but clearly nobody bothered reading it. Right. And of course,
I will refrain from comment, because that's not what Luther did, but continue.
Well, showing clearly like how fast loose I am in this general area, right? But basically, what I did as like a devout Christian at that time, looking to see, well, what the heck are the Trinitarians even saying, right? And why are they so freaking confusing, right? I really was like, okay, like, oh, I get it. I know about the triple point of water, gas, and like, so the Trinity is kind of like that. It's at the triple point. It's all three in one. And they're like, no, that is modalism. I'm like, okay. The Trinity is like, the Spirit is pre manifestation. The Father is like, materialism, and the Son is like, nope, that is also modalism. I'm like, okay, like whatever. Okay, so is the Spirit the interaction of love between the Son and the Father? So you got three in one. It's like, nope, also not allowed. I was like, it's almost like you guys are trying to produce a contradictory belief that I have to believe that's an explicit contradiction. And in my opinion, that's actually the whole freaking point of the Trinity. And I don't even mean that in like a atheist own type of way. How dare you? I actually think that is kind of the point of the Trinity. I think the point of a Trinity is a Zen koan to get you to stop thinking about God. It's sort of like a God protection layer, similar to how the ancient Hebrews refused to write down the name of the Tetragrammaton. It's essentially a theological Tetragrammaton where you're not able to think, because otherwise you would create an idol accidentally. I can vibe with that. It's just that nobody explained it like that, because everybody who is explaining it is in on the thing, right? If they explained it like that, then people would know, oh, so I don't have to believe the Trinity, right?
Right. Well, I think, if I may, you can keep going. It's just a lot of interesting stuff here.
Go ahead.
I appreciate you not being like a just cringe Dawkins kind of gotcha. Yeah. What do you believe in, a sky daddy? Oh man. Like, yeah. Like, what is fucking Sam Harris? Well, we've looked up in the sky and they haven't seen God yet. I'm like, fucking idiot.
It's like, wow. Actually, if I'm Roman, I could say, yeah, he's right there. He's that fucking constellation, mofo.
Exactly. Like, and there are human traditions throughout the ages have actually thought that. So, okay, like, again, from just a general understanding of religion, these people don't know what they're talking about. Whether you believe in this or not, it's like, I don't even care so much about that. I care about, can you like have an intelligible conversation about it, like we're doing? I like to think, differences aside. Yeah, no, I mean, as somebody who is a particular kind of Christian, so like so Protestant, let's say, as a broad term, I would agree that there I mean, Luther was kind of a troll back in his day, so I think I can use some modern day troll language to talk about theology. I think that's okay. I do think I think you, at least on a functional level, whether or not this is sort of the intent of theologians, we could debate that. But on a functional level, I think, yeah, part of the mystery, capital M, right?
Yes,
of
the
Trinity,
mystery. This is critical.
A mystery, like a holy mystery, like in that, almost in that pre-Christian Greek sense of like a mystery, right?
Yeah.
Is to pwn you. That's
yes.
part of it. Here we go, Elliott. I'm going to do my best. I got to talk to you tech people. It's a feature, not a bug. Okay, see,
exactly.
I can participate. I can do it too. It's a feature, not a bug. No, you know, it's designed to pwn you. You know, Johnny Cash could have easily sung "Sooner or Later God's Gonna Pwn You Down." Like that's the idea. It's to be like, yeah, and also I love your drawing of this sort of thematic similarity to the Tetragrammaton. Like, do not utter the name of God. Like, you're not supposed to do that, right? You as a mere mortal, who are you to try to grasp what is infinite and beyond infinity, who created everything, right? Like the ground of being. So that,
and by the way, that comparison, it's not even necessarily a metaphorical idea. It's a literal, actual translation back and forth, because magicians, especially back in that day, would have told you, if you know the name of the thing, then you know how to control it. So actually, this becomes very important when God is creating the universe and he names each elemental part, and then he lets man name all the animals and the plants and stuff. He is not just giving us the ability to label everything like, oh, what an honor that God would let us name stuff. No, he's also saying, I'm going to give you the actual magical power over the entire universe, which the scientists wouldn't even necessarily say is that crazy if you're thinking about it purely metaphorically, right? Of like, yes, our ability to be a cybernetic system gave us the ability to name the objects and therefore have magical control over them, a la science. But this is where it gets really weird. So I'll back off on that for a second.
No, that's fine. This is actually a topic for, we should do this as a separate episode, because I have, yeah, I think in a maybe not a metaphorical, but to borrow a Tolkienian term, a mythiopoetic sense, the use of language is inherently, I would argue, spiritual. Like it implies the fact that you can do it at all means that you're not an animal, which it has huge implications for you as a creature. So anyhow, but that's a topic for another day. Yeah.
Yep.
Anyhow, Trinity, the basic idea, in case anyone doesn't know, because we don't want to assume too much, is it so this sort of, okay, the standard, and by standard we put an asterisk next to it because there are differences between different Christian denominations, but the historical, maybe that's a better way of viewing it, the early in the Nicene Creed, right? You have several.
Actually, if you go back to the Apostles' Creed, the Trinity is there, and nobody disagrees about the Apostles' Creed.
Yeah, but because the Apostles' Creed is not, they did not need to make it as explicit as they did in the later Nicene Creed. Why did they have to make it so explicit in the Nicene Creed? Because there was all this controversy, as the Brits would say, surrounding is the Trinity, quote, a thing, unquote. That's really what they said. No, is it a thing? I'm translating it for the Gen Zs of today. Is it a thing?
Stop trying to make the Trinity a thing, Arius.
Oh my gosh, it's totally not a thing. Yeah.
And then the Mean Girls won.
Exactly. Well, hey, I actually, who won and who lost is an interesting question. So anyhow, the Trinity, the idea that there's Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, or Holy Ghost, however we want to translate that. I like Holy Ghost just because it's older, but I'm weird. So the idea is that, at least in the West, in Catholic and Roman Catholic derived forms of Christianity, and as much as Lutherans or Protestants such as myself might want to cope, you're derived from the Roman Catholic Church. Just get over it already. It happened.
Less fancy Catholics, even.
Yeah, we're the Diet Coke of Catholics. Yeah,
do you even adoration, bro? Like, come on.
Do you even adoration, bro? No, but we real presents, bro. So there you go.
But yeah, there you
go. We got that real presents. Man, if anyone doesn't have some sort of basic deal, I hope people are getting something out of this, because this is some like really niche humor.
Go look up Eucharistic adoration. It's pretty crazy.
It's interesting.
If you're looking for fodder for Catholics are pagans, like bruh, look at Eucharistic adoration. It's ridiculous.
I got some good friends who are Catholic. I personally, we talk about this. What we've kind of determined is that Collin doesn't get it, and that's okay, and that Collin kind of doesn't care, and that they're like, you're missing out. And I'm like, I don't care. And they're like, okay, and they would kind of move on with their life. So
to be fair, I think it is uncharitable to call Catholics pagans, right? Because they actually literally don't believe that they're praying to, just like you might say in a prayer circle, hey, could y'all pray for me on behalf of me? No Christian thinks that you're thinking about your friends as God. So similarly, no Catholic thinks that Mary is literally a deity that they're worshiping. Well, right. It's just a prayer circle.
But we're conflating a couple things here. So let's get back.
Correct.
We're talking about invocation of saints, and we're talking about we're talking about Eucharistic
too many theologies.
Let's get back to the Trinitarian stuff, because there's a couple of rabbit holes there and if you're not following along, that's okay. There was a couple of rabbit holes that happened really quickly. This is your brain on ADD, kids. Okay, so the idea is, right, in Western Christianity, God has one God, three persons. However you want to define that, and this is where it gets this is where I'm at a loss, because I'm not an expert in Trinitarian theology. I don't know the history of thought on how you define all the persons, but Father, Son, Holy Spirit / Holy Ghost. And so the idea is that it's a eternally existing triune God. As that's
right.
kind of like
co-eternal and co-eternal, which is
so there was not right. So the Son, and in Christian teaching, that's Jesus. The Son, Jesus Christ, is not created. This was a big another controversy. I'm just going to say it the British way. It was another controversy. It's like, was Jesus created? Some people think that Jesus didn't have a body and he was like a ghost floating around. Frickin' Gnostics. There was all sorts of
hey, the Docetists aren't always Gnostic. They're just trying to reconcile. Since you brought it up, I could let it in terms of courtroom debates. Right? No, it's all good. Well,
we don't need to solve any of these problems. Yes. But the idea is that
of course, no, we're not.
There's a lot of ideas that are competing with each other, and so like and this can seem like sort of pointy-headed stuff, and in some ways it is, but it's also really important, because if you're establishing yourself as a religion that's not Judaism, right, aka Christianity, right, then you're going to have to there's just a different focus, right? The idea is, or it gets the core of like a lot of what Christian belief and theology tries to wrestle with, which is like, can God suffer? Okay, so the Christian, the majority Christian belief is yes, but then what does that mean, right? So that it's this rabbit holes within rabbit holes of what does that mean? What does that mean about the nature of God? How does the Trinity continue to exist when you have an incarnate Son? I mean, all of this stuff. And again, I am
totally
not qualified to teach on that, because I just don't. There's a lot of historical thought. I'd have to do like months of reading before I could even really speak to that.
Well, no, and actually, like some of it is relatively straightforward, right? In terms of like, okay. Like, and it comes down to some of the ways that I listed off in the beginning of like, hey, I tried to resolve this into simpler ways, right? And resolving them in simpler ways, sort of the problem is that what the Trinity has to try to do is it has to try to bridge the gap between the entire Old Testament, right? And the notion of Christ being the Son of God, right, and dying for our sins in a physical world, because as a physical being, because if he's not physical in both of those senses, you're Gnostic, period, right? Like in a certain way, right? Because there's a non-physical version of this where the Gnostics are literally thinking that Christ was crucified on the moon, and that sounds wacky and stuff, but it's not as wacky as you think when you're thinking in terms of the way that the ancients thought about the moon and all of these things. Like it's not like
that's a real. I didn't know that there was a moon version. I'm gonna have to look that up.
Well, yeah, like the way you want to look at that is actually Richard Carrier. He does a lot of stuff around like who is the real historic Jesus, right? Because it's very important for mainline Christian theology that Christ died in physical reality as a physical being. Yeah. And the reason why is because we are as more or less pure physical beings, because again, if you want to be a Mormon, this isn't that much of a problem. You've had a soul before you were incarnated, right? But
if you're a Mormon,
if you're a Mormon, right? So there's no real issue of Jesus being physical or not physical, because you could be in his body as the spirit being version of yourself. But as a fully material being that happens to somehow have been joined to a soul, strangely joined, as one of my favorite hymns says.
Well, you need, like C.S. Lewis would say, to be an amphibian, like C.S. Lewis would say, right?
Yeah.
I think that's Lewis's way of viewing it, which I kind of love. It's like, yeah, an amphibian. Frogs are cool.
Fucking good job, C.S. Lewis, coming in clutch every time. Like, this guy's a baller. But basically, like, it's important that Christ had a literal physical body, that he was all human, right? So that he can, as a human, die on the cross for us fellow humans, right? And actually give a proper sacrifice. But if he wasn't all God, and this is where the Trinitarian basically bootstraps into it, right? If he wasn't all God, then how could he be the Son of God and not just some sort of, how could God have like come down and lived amongst us, right? And so you get through several different interpretations of what Christ is through there, because there's some people that say Christ was just a human and that he was adopted by God. Jehovah's Witnesses think this, right? Yeah. So they say he elected Christ to be the Son of God. The issue that the Jehovah's Witnesses run into, and I'm not making this argument either way, I'm not saying this is a knockout, I'm just saying that the issue that they run into, and they have to do a bunch of explaining around, is how...
To be fair, everyone has to do a lot of explaining. To be fair.
Everyone, exactly.
So all Christian groups are doing this kind of. This is the practice of theology. This is what this is the theology.
Right. So yeah. This is not me making a dig at literally anybody
everyone's
that we talk about, right? Yeah. Like so it's basically
sorry. My only thing is,
no, you're good. Go ahead.
I'll let you go. My only thing is that I'm not saying this to you. I'm just saying this in general. That there's this idea that it's just quote in the Bible. And I'm like, there's a lot of stuff that's quote in the Bible. You need a theological understanding to have a sense of what's going on.
Because I promise you, the Trinity is not obvious from a plain text reading of the Bible, and Trinitarians know this.
I would argue it is there because I personally have become convinced that it's there, and I believe that. But I can also totally get how somebody can look at the Bible, read through it, and go, I don't see it. I also I understand that because but anyhow, I dig at sort of people who think that you can just read the Bible and just like get it all, and that's like never. That's actually, that understanding of Scripture is only a couple hundred years old, probably not even that much, and that's
like a fundamentalist Christian understanding. It's not like a historical Christian at all.
Not even and no historical Protestant denominations, even the Protestants, even the Reformed, like low church Reformed Calvinists would not hold to that. So basically I like to think about a lot of the Reformation. It's like, ooh, maybe the Orthodox had it a little bit right. Until they see how pretty the church is, and they're like, we can't enjoy it, let's make it really dour. Anyhow, there can't be beauty in church. What's this? Hey,
right.
I can make fun of my own. All right.
So the problem that Jehovah's Witnesses run into when they go on the side of electionism is that they need to explain John, the freaking poet, right? John, not the Baptist, the Fever Dream John. He they have to explain what they mean by the Word was with God and the Word was God, right? So they have to do a little bit of interesting textual analysis of Greek, and it's all very boring and terrible.
John chapter 1. I know everyone says this, so I am not unique in this. It is my favorite part of the entire Bible, is John chapter 1. It's like all of it in one, and I kind of love it's so synthesized and wonderful. Anyhow,
right, and so that's the first. Now that's the basic. That's where the witnesses do quite a bit of work and have a lot of book. And I have the physical books, so when they change it, because they're one of the denominations that have no problem retconning their own beliefs, right?
Oh, interesting.
And again, I'm not saying that that's evil or not evil. I'm just saying, like, that's what they will do. So if you get your hands on any Jehovah's Witness tract, make sure to hang on to it, because they have no problem with having quote unquote further light and then updating and saying, you know what, it's okay, we believe that in the past, now it's fake, right? And they will pretend like they always had believed it, right? So, but again, that's not some sort of like crazy thing. The precedent is the Trinity, right? Because the Catholics in retrospect like to pretend the Trinity was clear for 400 years after Christ's death, but it was only the Council of Nicaea that everybody really hashed out what was meant. So it's not the witnesses, everybody does this.
No, everyone does this, right? And this is well, and in a really kind of Old Testament sense, this is wrestling with God, Israel. This is wrestling with the divine, right? And you do not have to be a Christian to be doing that, right? Like, this is sort of
correct.
You have to have some, if you have a belief in something beyond that's, what our material existence, then everyone's doing this to a certain extent. So there's no unique digs here except against the Bible only people. So that and I made the digs. You can blame Collin for that one. So
the Bible only people also need to really think hard. Actually, the problem is that the Bible only people are modernists and everybody else is postmodernists, right? The Bible only people is like, oh no, the text explains itself, and everybody else is like, no, there's many narratives, meta narratives you can apply to this text, right? So there you go. It's pomo versus the only non-pomo in Christianity are fundamentalists. Everybody else is pomos.
Well, the Bible fell from the sky. It fell from the sky in the King James form too. It's really interesting what happened. So
the King James form, of course. No, but this is okay. So I hope. All right. So the whole reason for that big ass tangent on like who is Jesus, right, is to motivate the following observation, right?
Okay.
That was never really a problem until the Christians came along, right? So the Jewish understanding, and this is very critical, the Jews sort of have and still have this notion is God is one, and that's the number one rule, is there is one God and he is one, period, end of story, right? We have lots of conceptions about what he is, but he is one, period, end of story. And the Christians like to say, oh, a new entity has entered the field, aka Christ, right? Or Jesus, or the Son of God, right?
Jesus has entered the chat.
Jesus has entered the chat, right? So there you go, chat.
I'm talking to the Gen Z here. Just bear with me. They have to understand. Okay.
The IRC, the Gen Z IRC. Anyway, point being is that that's a dig at us elder millennials. But point being is that so all of a sudden, when you have another person kicking it with God in heaven, right? You have this issue, right? Is Christ then an archangel?
Because right, Christ ascends. So yes, body,
he descends,
resurrection,
and then he ascends.
death, resurrection, physical. This is physical resurrection, and then ascension. So there's a lot of, because then it's like, okay, so now a human body. So this is humans and this is humanity and God coming together. And again, I'm so not an expert in Eastern Orthodox theology, but I know that that's like one of the cornerstones, right? Is the reuniting of humanity and God. So most Christian denominations or sects have this kind of thing, but it's similar to how a lot of people listen to music, but people have different genres, right? So like different denominations of Christianity historically tend to believe there's differences in belief. Most of the beliefs are actually pretty much the same, but there's a huge amount of different emphasis, right? So us dour Lutherans are all about how your good actions really don't amount to much in the cosmic scale of things. Doesn't mean you shouldn't be good, but it means that you should not do good works to advance your sort of your state in the world or in heaven. That's a product right out of that comes out of the Reformation, right, where Luther's dealing with all this sort of late medieval Catholicism, right? And in a similar fashion, right, like in the East, there's all other sort of theological trends going on that are still trending, right? They're still trending. So the reuniting of humanity and God in the physical person and the person of the Trinity of Jesus. It's this whole thing, and it's highly mystical as it tends to be in the East. And so, yeah, that's just
right.
flavor.
So
that's flavor text right there. So flavor text.
Yes,
yeah.
There you go. Flavor. Yeah. Right. So the Jews never really had this problem because for them, the Spirit of God, and this is not, and of course, again, all of this is very complicated, blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of disagreement in Jews now and previously, because if you look at the Sadducees and the Pharisees and blah, blah, even the time of Christ, even, again, like scholars have clearly identified different competing narratives in the deuterocanonical text, which are the first 5 books of Moses, right? So Genesis, Deuteronomy, Numbers, Leviticus, Exodus, those guys. There is 2 Noah stories. So if you're ever reading the Bible and you're like, I feel like I just read that verse.
There's 2 creation, right? There's 2 creation myths too. There's
literally back to back, right? And one is the first one is the one that the scientists like to say they don't know what they're talking about,
right?
And then the second one is actually right. And the second one is actually correct as per modern science, right? So we can see that even back in the freaking forever ago, they were thinking about these things, and these have different meanings and probably different readings, but there was a very clear, and again, this all is getting back to the Trinity. It's just very necessary to actually fully motivate why all this is important, right? But basically, oh goodness Lord. So there's good reason to believe that there were northern, and we know this was the case, obviously, but there was northern Jewish priests, right, that were part of Israel, right? And there were southern Jewish priests, which were Judea. I say Hebrew probably is a better word, but and they came together, and the northerners had a golden calf worshiping based situation, and the southerners did not, or that's reversed, either way. And when the priests came together under like some conquests, essentially, they had to reconcile whose books do we get to read out of. And here's the thing you got to remember is that literally books that were used, the scrolls and stuff, like these cost about the same cost as a car to manufacture back in the day.
Yeah.
Like a book is literally, so if you're a priest and you are given sort of responsibility over this book, like you are being given the responsibility of the equivalent of a car, right? And so it's actually
more like a Ferrari or something, or Lambo.
A Lambo, right?
Yeah,
think about it like that. You get the Lambo, and so these people had to meet together and be like, hold on, my gasoline, I use diesel and you use gasoline. How do we drive similar cars? It's like, okay, we'll figure. Well, you know what they did is like, we're gonna have 2 tanks of gas. If you are the priest who uses diesel, put it in the left. If you're the priest who uses gas, put it on the right. Right. And that's literally what these priests would do. They know when they got to this part of the liturgical year, they were going to have to skip every other verse for their particular congregation who is used to hearing the Noah story in this way versus the other one. They said, look, our congregations don't talk anyway. Fuck it. Let's just be separate, but equal. Wink, wink. Right. Yeah. So you see this shit happening throughout the entire history of the Bible. Right. So again, this isn't crazy.
This is not new. Well, as the Bible says, there's nothing new under the sun. This kind of the wrestling with God is just, it's like, it goes back, I would argue, to the beginnings of humanity, because humans have always had, we've talked about this in previous episodes, not with Elliott, but in sort of like the Tolkien episodes, right? You get humans, you get language, you're going to get myth. It's just going to happen. It's just going to happen. So yeah, it's pretty ancient.
So okay. So we've established clearly that the Jewish people, since the beginning of time, were not a monolith. So that's fair enough. But it was everybody agreed within this, similar to Christians, right? Unless they're wild heretics, right? Everybody agreed that that there was one God who was one person, period, end of story, no questions asked, right? And there was no worries because they didn't have this son situation. God talked to the high priest through the temple, right? Because remember, it was a temple cult for a long time, post Abraham, post all this stuff, right? It became like a post tabernacle, basically, right? There was always one dude who got to talk to God directly, and that dude had a dangerous job because if he talked to God wrong, they would tie a rope around his ankle in case he got killed in the holiest of holies, and they'd have to drag him back out again, right? Because nobody else was allowed to go in there. But okay,
we've all seen Raiders of the Lost Ark. We know.
Exactly. Like, and there's some interesting theories around like why that might have been the case. But anyway, we won't go into God being an electrostatic, or the Ark of the Covenant being an electrostatic battery or whatever, because that might be a little bit kooky. But point being is that,
well, this is the wandering humanist, not Joe Rogan. So yeah,
exactly. So okay, so they didn't really have this problem because they're very clear God is one. Now you're like, but Elliott, they had this notion of the Spirit of God, also not a problem because God was a spirit, right? So no issues here, right? Like literally Yahweh, if you breathe out without vocalizing, you have this, or you kind of like, that's very similar to like Yahweh, right? Like there's this notion that God is literally the breath that we breathe, the wind in the air. Like, again, if you're being heretical and a sort of secular theologist, you're like, well, dude, the Jews clearly had a progression of like polytheism to henotheism, where they had a high god, aka the name Yahweh, who is a warrior / storm god like Zeus, right? Not exactly like Zeus, but similar in nature. And then, then they said, nope, none of the angels and demons, like none of those are gods. They're just spiritual beings that like are not even slightly God, right? So that's why this never came up, this Trinitarian problem. And again, it never came up for the Muslims either, right? So if you're the type of person that's like, well, Jesus was just very inspired by God, well, and you believe in God still, you're probably actually some sort of weird pseudo-Muslim, right? In that way, because the Muslims say that Jesus is a prophet in the line of prophets, great guy, fantastic, touched by God for sure. Everything he says is holy.
Great guy. Yeah, and I know great people. He's wonderful. He's the best. The greatest. You know them. Good no choice. Anyhow, yeah. Sorry, you set it up. Yeah.
Yep.
Whereas a Trinitarian Christian will say Jesus is not just a good guy. Jesus is God incarnate, and he walked amongst us. Those are very different statements, right? Like, regardless of what you believe or whether you believe any of it, right? Those are like qualitatively different statements, I would argue. Of course, I'm biased because I happen to believe the Trinitarian one, but you know what I mean?
But they actually are. They're literally different. Very different. It's objectively the case.
To say that there are good and bad people, okay, right? Like you can just look around the world and go, yes, there's people who do better things than other people, right? And okay, and if you can make the leap to faith, sort of in a Kierkegaardian sense, and go, okay, I believe in God, you're like, well, okay, so maybe God's working through some people more than others, or however you want to do that, right? But that's all of that is sort of, that's a lot different than saying, okay, but this guy is God, like, and God's also and God's everywhere, but he's also this guy, and
this is where it gets
a very different statement to make.
No, it is a very different statement, right? So basically, like, the way that I resolved the Trinity, when I was this sort of version of a heretic Christian, now I'm a different type of heretic, by the way, but I can't just be a fucking mainstream, am I right? But anyway, point being is that like gotta be edgelords,
Like the flyers, like what? You didn't hear that? What?
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. Well, and actually,
violence is bad, kids. It was a joke. All right.
Right. And actually, in a medieval sense, it's actually a wildly merciful act, right? Because if you can torture the person to repenting, then they don't get permanent torture, right? They get heaven right afterwards. So, like, what are we talking about? They get to avoid the rest of the Black Death, and they get to go to heaven. Like, come on. Anyway, the point being is that okay, so we've sufficiently motivated that like the Trinity is in fact different. It's not a trivial difference, and we've motivated the fact that you need to deal with the Trinity, certainly at the very least, given John chapter 1 verse 1, right? Because
let's try to bring it back to cybernetics though. So let's, because that's the turn that you're going to have to make, because I'm curious to see how you're going to do this, but let's start making that turn.
Yep. Okay. So there one last bit, right, on the nature of God here, right, is that we have this notion of the Father, the Spirit, or the Ghost, right? The Father, the Spirit, and the Son, right? And the Father is if you know the Nicene Creed, you'll read along at home, right? I'm not going to recite the Nicene Creed because I don't have it memorized, but basically, like, the Father is the creator, right? He is the ultimate decider too, right? Like, he is the king, right? The ruler, the regnant, right? The Son also rules in heaven, sitting on the throne of God, right? But he rules under kind of a different, charter, so to speak, right? It's possible to have rulers and sub-rulers. He rules because he is the particularized, human God interface, if you will, right? Because he is the person.
That's a good way to look at it. Yeah.
Right? Like he's the part of God that I think even in heaven, if we looked at God, even as heaven's spiritual beings, we still not would understand what he looks like. We would just not even get it. But if we looked at Christ, we would understand it.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. We would see Christ. So Christ is literally the only way that a being who has ever been finite could possibly see God. And Christ says this, if you have seen me, you have seen the Father, which is another reason why Trinitarians say they're the same. Now, another reason why Trinitarians say they're the same is that in the baptism of Christ, the Holy Spirit shows up like a dove, which, by the way, is a pigeon, right? Fun fact. So the dove, right? The Holy Spirit, shows up along with Christ being baptized, and that is sort of the clearest notion of the Trinity being a thing. So so let's set this up. The Father is the decider, right? He's the one who separates one thing from another thing, right? The Son is the actor, right? He's the one who actually materialized in physical reality and did some historical stuff within history, because God is ahistorical. He's atemporal, exists outside of time and space necessarily. Otherwise, he's not God, right? He's not supernatural. So Christ is the actor, and then the Spirit. There's a couple of spots in there's a couple of spots in the Bible that the Spirit is moving and observing, right? The Spirit is actually the one who is looking within God to understand God better, which is totally not that crazy when you consider how would an infinite being understand itself? And you're like, well, it's omnipotent. Well, what would that omnipotence look like, right? Maybe there is a being who holds the observations of the omnipotence within itself. That is kind of the what the Spirit does through several biblical things. So now we have the Spirit of God being the observer, right? The perceiver, the inputter. You have the controller, the Father, and you have the actor, the outputter, the Son, the one that actually in physical reality does the stuff. So how does this tie back to cybernetics? We have one person of the Trinity being the inputter, the Spirit. We have one person of the Trinity being the controller, the decider, the Father. And then we have one person being the outputter, the actor, the Son. And in order for it to be a cybernetic system, you inseparably have to have all three things concurrent. To take apart any one of them would ruin the cybernetic system. And so this is my deeply heretical claim against like the mystery side of things, is that actually the Trinity can be understood as a cybernetic system.
I mean, I guess. I think, not being an expert, as I've said many times, but hedging yet again, I think the one thing that would perhaps be considered heretical there is that you're claiming that you can understand it perfectly, probably first and foremost, and that another potentially heretical thing would be that you're assigning particular. You're not saying, well, like, the Father is like the blah blah, or he does this thing, but you're saying that like this is his role and this is it. That you're confining. You're confining like set roles, I guess.
Okay.
That's just
so actually
but I'm certain. Certain that somebody who is a Trinitarian theologian would also have more to say about it. But that's again, as an educated non-expert in it, something like that. I would imagine that would perhaps be what potentially would be seen as spicy, I guess.
So and that's totally cool. So here is what's kind of and so I was predicting some of this feedback. So now I'm going to go into the next level of cybernetic systems, which is second order cybernetics, right? Okay. And a second order cybernetic system is a cybernetic system who has within the controller, essentially, or somewhere within the system, but I think it's specifically within the controller, the ability for it to observe itself, right? So it has an input, and part of that input it can observe what it observes. It can observe what it's choosing, and it can observe what it is doing, and then make a decision about those three observations, and then make an action within itself about those three systems and attempt to take an action that modifies any one of those things. So it's sort of like a self-referential, it's a recursive, right? If you're familiar with that word, but it's a self-referential entity. And all humans are second order cybernetic systems.
Well, yeah.
We're not just like the thermostat.
Right. And that's have you read Kierkegaard?
Not very much, but
that's
go ahead.
Kierkegaard. That Kierkegaard said that back in the 1800s. So we should do an episode on Kierkegaard. This is the I believe that's beginning of sickness unto death. This is the self-relating self bit. He doesn't use the word cybernetic.
Yes.
It's,
of course not.
The whole idea, the second order cybernetic thing, that's almost exactly what Kierkegaard said. So yeah.
No, exactly, right. And this whole notion of self-reference is not something that the cybernetic people came up with themselves. It's just that they were the first ones to apply it.
It's also not unique to Kierkegaard. It's just he's one of my favorite writers, so I'm going to quote him. So yeah.
No, for sure. And he probably says it quite clearly in a certain way, which is great, right?
We should do something on that. It's really quite good. Yeah.
Okay, so now I'm gonna make a distinction. Now that I've introduced the notion of a second order cybernetic system, and I think it's very obvious that the Trinity is a second order cybernetic system, right? Whether you see the spirit as filling the role of that internal observer, or whether you see all three of them having their own, because they're persons within this Trinity, right? And a person does mean that it's a cybernetic agent, right? That is to say, all of them have some sort of agency.
It could.
Right.
You have to ask yourself whether that was. I'm not saying you can't make this argument right now. I'm not saying I agree with you. I don't really know because I'm trying to understand it. Right. My only point
this is live on. This is live. Like, this isn't like
yeah. Screw it. We'll do it live. We're doing it live. So I guess this is a question. It's not designed to knock you down a peg. It's just a question. A question one could ask would be, I'll put it as subjunctively as possible. One could ask the question, is that what the, let's say, church fathers present at the Council of Nicaea meant by person? Did they have a proto-cybernetic understanding of person or personhood? Or did they not? And I am not qualified to answer that question, but it's just a question I would maybe potentially throw out there. So
So I think so let's do a retreat into Mises for a second, right?
Lord,
and go back.
To see you connect these two is going to be great. Okay, I'm like, what? Okay. Retreat to Mises. Yeah, okay.
Right, we're going to retreat to Mises and talk about human action, right, for a second, right?
Okay.
And instead, we're gonna. My claim is that, and again, I'm not saying that theologically speaking, that person, for the sake of theology, is the same thing as a human actor. However, and of course, there's theological issues with even saying that the persons of the Trinity act properly, right? Because action in some ways, right, implies, in a Misesian sense, a preference, right? Or some sort of insufficiency, and therefore the God is not sufficient, blah, blah, blah. But what's great is that the cybernetic system gets around this, in my opinion, by not even making reference to completeness or not completeness in terms of their quote unquote actions. But it is clear that the Spirit and the Father and the Son interact with each other in some way in heaven, in a meaningful way. Maybe it's an eternal way, maybe it's a non-temporal way, but is in some sense like they are sort of, we see that the Father sends the Spirit, right? Well, what does that mean, really, right? Like, well, since the Spirit is interacting with physical reality, there is a sense in which the Spirit is acting, quote unquote, in nature, even if it's outside of nature, poking your spirit, that then pokes you, that then pokes your body, right? Still, like, there is this notion of an action in there, regardless of whether, I'm not saying it's a Misesian sense, I'm saying but if you think about it as like, hey, a person is somebody who acts, air quotes, then again, are the Nicene Fathers thinking that way? Probably not. But I think that future theologians might think in that general direction. Is all I'm saying.
Yeah, well, and I mean the whole idea. It's interesting. I've never heard I like Mises. I just don't tend to think of him as being applied to theology. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying I have to wrestle with that one. It's like Bill and Ted. Whoa.
Exactly.
But I guess one quick thing that just this popped into my mind is, you talk about like, so like, for example, at Pentecost, right? Like, so the Spirit is sent, and right, and it interacts with real people, right? It does the interacty thing. But also, like, let's not forget that Moses like sees God's back, right? Like God, like he can't see his face, but Moses has this vision, and like, okay, there's all different ways to interpret that, right? But I guess the idea is, or the point that maybe you're making, and at the very least that I'm trying to make, is that the three persons of the Trinity are also, they're not like doing just one thing, right? Because there's overlap between them in the Christian scriptures as well in terms of roles. So I think that's maybe is that what you were trying to go for?
That's what I'm like trying to continue to establish, is that, like, yes, I agree with you that, like, it's clear that it's not that, and this is the important thing about person, it's not that these parts of the Trinity are like your heartbeat and your brain and your lungs, right? Your brain, you kind of have some funky control over, but not really. Your heartbeat, you have almost no control over, and your lungs, you have control over sometimes and you don't other times, right? So in this metaphor, your brain would be the Father, the Spirit would be your heart, and Christ would be your lungs, right? But it's not like that. It's not like that. They're fully autonomous, but co-equal and co-eternal and united through one essence, right? Essentially, they are one. Right, and essentially it's very important. Go look up what essence is. Yeah. It's very
I'm appreciating the puns here. Yes, I see what you did.
Right. So it's critical, right? And these puns are both puns and also like the theology. This is great about theology. So right, like so that is to say that the three persons are three, not separate, because they're not separate, right? But they are capable of, quote unquote, acting individually. It's not that they're three faces of one entity, is what I'm trying to say, right? They can't be reduced like that, So anyway, point being is that, and there's a lot more like really ancient theology that these people are fighting against, like God being simple, right? Because frequently the definition of God is that, he is the most thing that you could possibly think of, but is simple, but is infinite, right? There's a lot of buts. But so I need to real quick do a quick distinction between what I would call, and I haven't seen this literature anywhere, this is be freestyle, and this is why you're an intellectual street fighter, you know what I mean? A philosophical street fighter, right? Is that there's this notion in my head of an individual cybernetic system, and then a deliberative cybernetic system, right? Or a emergent cybernetic system, right? Yeah. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that the individual cybernetic system is like your thermostat. It's one system that has one controller, right? The deliberative cybernetic system would be like the thermostat in one room and then the thermostat in the other room, right? So they're both making measurements of the different rooms, but both actions, interact with each other. So if you set a thermostat to 6 degrees in one room and 70 degrees in the other room, one is going to turn off well before the other, right? And the other is going to turn on well before the other, right? And so they act together to regulate the system, but they just have different quote unquote preferences, right? So another human way is that an individual human, one person with one body is an individual cybernetic system, but a deliberative body in terms of like Ronar or like a family can act as a cybernetic system. How does this work? Let's say that your family has a rule that guests have to take off the shoes at the door. The family as a whole, all individually have sensory inputs that allow them to notice that the shoes have been not removed. And so each individual family member might act on that, but as a group, they decided that the controller, right? So they have a controlling body, which is the family as a whole, which could be democratic, it could be hierarchical, however that ends up being.
What family is democratic? Yeah, the thing that was popping into my head is, but he who is sovereign, the one who is sovereign is he who decides the exception. Who gets to keep the shoes on? Sorry.
Yep. No, and that's
yeah.
But that's important. And the sovereign are the parents, obviously.
Yeah, the parents are the
notice that
the exception.
Notice that
we get to have ice cream today, but not every day. Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But notice that actually this reinforces this notion of like what I would call layered emergent cybernetic systems, where the parents are a cybernetic entity within the family. The family is a cybernetic entity, and the family has this following things. It has the individual children, and then it has the parents as a cybernetic unit, and then it has each individual parent as a cybernetic unit within those first two. You see what I mean? So groups are capable of being a cybernetic entity, and the clearest version of this is a Robert's Rules of Order society, right? Where people are allowed to vote on what, quote unquote, the body of that organization does. And they might assign the acting role to a particular member or agent of that group, but no individual member is allowed to be the sole controller, right? So there's this notion of an individual cybernetic system and then an emergent cybernetic over cybernetic systems, or over systems that are not cybernetic, right? So there is this notion of like, you could see an ecosystem, so to speak, in biology being a cybernetic system, right? Because it has inputs, which is weather, and then that system moves as a whole. Like the trees do stuff, the animals do stuff, and it balances the whole ecosystem. So the classic example is wolves and rabbits, right? The wolves eat too many rabbits, and then they starve. The rabbits produce too many, and so they run out of grass, and the wolves eat them anyway. And so it's this self-regulating thing where you could, again, you could say, you could model this scenario as the wolves and the rabbits are, as species, noticing what's happening to each other. Now, of course, they're not really noticing, but the cybernetic system as a first order doesn't need to be self-aware. The second order one does need to be self-aware, and that's where the family is self-aware of itself as a family, right? So I hope that kind of makes sense. So essentially, and another example is that singular neurons fail to be an individual because they are not self-aware, although neurons are also cybernetic systems. And so your brain is made up of like trillions of cybernetic systems, right? So so that is to say, I would posit that the Trinity is not necessarily, don't think about it as an emergent cybernetic system, right? It's sort of this funky, the way that Trinitarians would have to resolve this is to say, hey, no, there are three cybernetic systems that are not subordinate to another one, nor are they subordinate to each other, right? But they are themselves all able to act as one, right? So to speak, right? And so, that would be my more, subtle approach to that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think the way I'll have to continue to noodle this over, as they say. I think it always comes back to Tolkien for me, so I'm going to bring it back to Tolkien. I think the whole idea of looking at, at least as you've described it, and at least as I've understood it in my very layperson's way, looking at the Trinity through a cybernetic lens, I think offers a great kind of allegorical. It's a great allegory.
Yes.
But as a Tolkienian, I would make a distinction between myth and allegory. And I would say that this allegory, all fine and good in the sense that it helps you perhaps grasp the not the nature, but the feeling, for lack of a better word, the feeling of what Trinitarian belief is trying to get at. But I would argue my I don't even know if it's a retort. It's just sort of I would say that, like any allegory, it fails in the end because it is too reductive. And that so I'm not. Yeah, that's my kind of very Tolkien influenced way of. That's my initial reaction. Is like, yeah, it works great as an allegory, but it does not. I don't think it. I think in terms of like jumping into myth, capital M, and believing the myth of like, I'm going to be a Trinitarian or not, or whatever you are, right? Believing in anything. I think that mystery has to be part of it. And when you get overly reductive and you're trying to cram the nature of God into an allegory, that's fine to do it as an allegory. But when then you elevate the allegory to, I would caution against elevating the allegory to a position of myth, and by myth I mean that in a very Tolkien sense, like capital M.
Yes.
Myth. Yeah. So
and I think that's a perfect way of describing it in terms of like, to believe that this is God, and that's the trick. It's not that this is God, right? That this is a descriptive thing to talk about God, because God necessarily, I think, in a certain way, is not describable by any other thing, and that's one of the key factors of distinguishers of God versus us, right? I would just I just kind of put it forward as a way of thinking about how the three persons of the Trinity interact as one, quote, being together, right? Because it helps to give slightly more rigor to an analogy that is sometimes made between two parents and the child, except for, of course, it's a horribly failing analogy because the child is generated from the parents, right? Which is a big no-no, right? Yeah. But that's why it gets around that, is that it's a slightly better analogy than the ones that we could think of, and it in a certain way allows the entity to be the actual thing, the cybernetic thing, without having to say that it's an abstraction from the three, right? Because the family is an abstraction from the three individuals. It doesn't really exist until you're like, oh, it's a cybernetic system. And then boom, you can make it an object. It's some sort of a virtual object in that way. But like, it's really helped me think about like how the lefties are talking about stuff, by the way. But anyway.
Okay, so that's another, I don't know how we got there, but yes. I guess that's just my like initial reaction to it. And I mean, I will say that regardless of one's attitude towards like whether a cybernetic model can be or should be applied to Trinitarian thought, I mean, it is interesting, even just as like a thought, right? Like, even if you hate it and you disagree with it, like, it's a thought, right? Like, it's a way, it's something that, it's an idea that probably should be wrestled with. So which is to say, thank you for sharing it, because that had never crossed my mind before. So
yeah, totally. So that's kind of like the punchline, although I do have one tiny last little fun thought experiment, if you're down for it, for too long. Hit us with
the thought experiment.
Okay, so are you familiar with the Turing test?
I've heard of it, not familiar with how it works or what it is.
Yeah. So Right. So the Turing test is sort of the gold standard of AI in certain ways, or it's the first gold standard of AI. I'll say it like that. The Turing test basically says, and this is done by Alan Turing, who was around in the 1990s thinking about computing. He broke the Enigma code that the Nazis were using, very important mathematician in the British war effort. Really, like, if you're into personal biopics too, he's one of the most fascinating people to look at, because he is a great example of what kind of a society tries to do when they have an obvious hero on their hands that they cannot categorize because he was gay, right? So he was gay, and so they sterilized him near the end of his life because he was gay, but they couldn't like do anything bad against him because like he was this huge ass war hero. But anyway, not the point. Like, he's a fascinating guy. And so Turing said, hey, let's pretend like you're sitting down and you are given bits of paper, because this is the 1990s, right? Or 1900s, right? You're given bits of paper, one that's written by a real human and another that's written by a computer, right? The Turing test is passed by the computer if you are unable to tell the difference between the human or the computer.
Right.
So this is kind of like the first blush at trying to define an artificial intelligence, right? And so I'm thinking, oh, let's talk about cybernetic systems in that way, right? Because when you got to hammer everything's a nail. So I'm like, okay, so a human is a cybernetic system, and AI is clearly a Robert's Rules of Order committee is totally one, aka it's a Robert's Rules of Order committee, or a deliberative body is another one. A computer is one, and yourself is one, right? So this is where it gets kind of interesting, right? It's like, let's suppose that you're given now not just two, but 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You're given 5 bits of paper, right? And I'll also say, look, obviously you might remember what you wrote, so we're going to say that like some of the words are changed, in the responses that you get back from yourself yourself so that it's not string literally the same, right? So the question here is, which of these systems would you say that a human and the deliberative body of humans are both human, right? Because that's kind of interesting, because in theory, the deliberative body of humans could actually model itself as if it was a full person. And the reason why this is interesting is, like, Mitt Romney said forever ago, well, corporations are people, my friend.
Yep.
He was correct in terms of like the legalese. They are people, but actually, if you instead of person, you do like second order cybernetic system, right? That's freaking true, right? It is a self-aware cybernetic entity that models itself exactly like a person. In fact, it can even send a whole ass person to like convince you that it's a person, right? You know, and the computer and the AI are interesting, but yourself too, right? Is the reason why I put that in there. Is like, you know, it's quite possible, depending on how well you write, you might not even categorize yourself as a human, depending, right? Like, I don't know, you know what I mean? It's just kind of the thought experiment. Yeah.
No, that's interesting. Yeah. So, I like that you brought Mitt Romney into it, because I love to make fun of that guy. Anyhow, cool. Well, amen. Elliott, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, no, I was just saying, amen.
Amen. Yeah. Thanks for sharing this. Thanks for exploring this with us. Any did you want to plug anything before you say goodbye? Is there anything?
Last time I said I was going to have shit to plug. I don't have anything to plug. I mean, obviously I'm working on shit in the background, because I didn't have any of this done last time we talked, and now I have shit done, and I really need to put up a thing that maybe could be commented later as the thing to go find some of this stuff. But anyway, there you go.
All right. Well, yeah. And everyone, you can follow me on Twitter at Altphilologe. I know it's a German word, but you can copy paste it if you're interested. I'll put it in the description of the video here. And yeah, I hope people are doing well. Thanks for tuning in. Like, comment, subscribe, all the things. Yeah, I'm hoping at some point soonish we can get at least one video up looking at the Rings of Power. So, I have lots to say about that, and hopefully we can get Marshall on soon here, and we can break it down old school. All right. And with that, I wish everyone a great rest of your evening, and yeah, I'll see everyone later.